Pretty eyes, pretty thighs, shawty, she a dime. Demon girl, evil eyes, she be telling lies. Slim waist,
All right, so today is my pleasure to interview Mr. Michael Langer, co-founder of TRX Capital and an experienced venture capitalist. So for people listening, if you don't remember, he's actually the son of Dr. Bob Langer, a guest we go on season 2, the biotech podcast, and also his father's a co-founder of Moderna, and his son is now on the podcast. So, Mr. Langer, thank you for being part of this episode. I just want to say I've interviewed your father, his business partner, Dr. Derek Rossi, who was the first guest on my podcast, and several of his students, and I've had really great interviews with them. So, again, in light of a really bright career, can you take us back and tell us about your background?
Yeah, sure. I was lucky enough as a high schooler to spend some of my summers at VC funds, and so that gave me some early exposure to getting to see some of the ins and outs of how these things work, in terms of both the startup side and then the investing side. Obviously, I didn't add all that much value at 16, but I think exposure, I think is really helpful for me to be able to really get to understand, what it was about these things that was interesting. And I think for me, it was always a place that I found a lot of interest in. Just seeing what my dad had done and the impact that it could have on the world. And so as I have grown older, I started in more business development roles. I really like the partnership side of things, particularly because I just really enjoyed sort of the process of negotiating deals and having to think about it sort of like a puzzle of, how do you get this other side to agree to a deal so that your company obviously is in a good position with your deal, but also making them still feel good about that deal. And that's a really interesting process. And then I started doing some investing with my family about 6 years ago. And we saw some successes with that. And now I've started this new fund called TRX Capital. I can't say all too much about that now because we're still in stealth mode. But I'm happy at sort of the highest level to answer any questions.
Yeah, okay. So, I actually a few episodes ago, I actually got a Stanford professor, and his dad was also famous, just like your dad. His dad was the journal editor of New England Journal of Medicine. So I'm going to ask you this question. So I mean, obviously your dad's pretty famous. He's been on my podcast. He's a co-founder of Moderna. Do you ever feel like you were going to be under a shadow at some point?
Oh, my dad?
Yeah.
I mean, how can you not? I think it depends on your age. For me, I think when I was younger, that was harder, right? Because you're still
Mhm.
sort of like formulating who you are. And so I think, everyone's always like being like, oh, when you have these big shoes and, this, that, or the other. And so I think when you're younger, that's, it's uncomfortable. But I think as you get older, maybe by the time I was 25, I'm 34 now. I think you just start getting used to it and comfortable with it. And I think it can go in a lot of different ways. I think, some people sort of flee away from that. And so they go into other professions. They don't want to be anywhere near that shadow. I think for me, and then I think some people where they just sort of, they grind their teeth and they try to make it work. I think for me, I see it more like, honestly, like a weapon. Like I think, I'm incredibly fortunate to have had the experiences and the access points that I have because of our family. And I feel like because of the platform we have, we can make great impact with that. And so, I'm thrilled to get to work with my family, particularly my father, because, I think first off, it's fun. But I think second of all, it's also just something where I think I can make more impact because of that platform than if I just did it on my own. So I've over time become comfortable with that. And so I think some of those things that maybe when you're younger in your teens or early 20s, where you might feel self-conscious or insecure, I think over time, at least for me, I've grown to feel quite comfortable in my situation.
Yeah. So I mean, I saw your LinkedIn that you worked at Living Proof, and so
Yeah.
I think I think your dad and I discussed it prior, but we didn't discuss it too much. So what is that company? What role were you playing in that company?
Well, I didn't play much of a role. I interned there during a summer when I was
Uh,
in college. But Living Proof is a really cool example of sort of this cross section of innovation that can happen when you take great science and you take it to a consumer industry. And so there was a venture capital fund called Polaris, and one of the partners there had a couple of daughters, and he looked at the shampoo labels and was curious as to, what are the ingredients in these things? And what he realized is that basically every single one of them has silicone as the active ingredient. And so they then went to my dad and they were like, hey, Bob, can we make this better? And so in over a few years, they decided to explore this, and that was sort of the impetus of Living Proof. So Polaris and my father, they created Living Proof, and I think at first it struggled to some level, but then over time they had a lot of really great success, and it was ultimately a really good outcome. And it's a great example of how if you use great science and make great products, you can make a great company. And so, they started with the first product called No Frizz. So they basically used a binding agent to the hair so that your hair wouldn't frizz, when there's a lot of humidity. And then over time, they made more products, and it's a great company. I think, ironically for my father, until Moderna probably became one of the most well-known things he had done, just because obviously people pay more attention sometimes to, consumer products than they would, the next therapeutics company.
yeah, I heard your dad stepping down from Moderna or something.
Yeah. Yeah, they announced that today. Yeah, he's very excited about his the developments that they've had there and his work there. So, Moderna has been a great experience for him, and he's very excited where the company's been and also where it's going.
I mean, I think it's hard as a biotech R&D company to become a big pharmaceutical. I've talked to many guests and they said it's it's incredibly difficult from a small startup to become like a huge pharmaceutical, because either most of them go to bankruptcy or they get acquired. So I think Moderna is a really good example.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy, but it's exciting. I think Moderna is a testament to what great innovation can be at scale and in the public eye. Seeing what Moderna has done is, I think, really incredible, and the impact that it's had in the world. And, I think hopefully we'll continue to.
So yeah, I think 2 months ago, I think there's a company called Zara Therapeutics. So the CEO was former Stanford Chancellor Dr. Mark Levine. So it's an AI drug discovery startup. It has now more than $1 billion in funding. So I'm just asking you, as an investor, venture capitalist, are you shocked about how such a early stage startup is able to acquire that much funds, especially $1 billion in funds?
Um, I don't know that I'm surprised. I think there are certain venture capital funds that have a significant amount of money, and so they can do different kinds of risk stratification of how to make investments. And I think this as an area is one that people are excited about. And so I think that was a risk they were willing to make. And obviously they have a lot of money to do a lot of things, and potentially it could be a great outcome.
So I know you're a former corporate executive at Peer Therapeutics. So what leadership qualities do you believe are important for a biotech executive?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the role. The CEO, the COO, CCO, all these things, I think have different things that we would want to see. Um, so I think as a CEO, you want to be able to motivate a lot of people. So basically what that means is I think you want to be able to believe that you can get a lot of people excited about an idea, both internally and externally. Externally, because you need to be able to raise more money and get people to get on board. And internally, because you want to be able to get your employees excited about what you're doing so they're motivated. And so that takes, a very specific personality to be able to get all these people to be invested. But I think there are other qualities that are important too. I think because of that, you want to see things like humility. I think you really want to be able to believe that these are people that you certainly would want to get behind for a long time, because they have really, I think, incredible qualities as human beings as well, that inspire you as the employee, because you're waking up every day, sometimes 10, 12 hours a day to be pushing forward. And so you want to have a leader that you really believe in. So I think things like humility, charisma, kindness, but directness, all these things are things that are really important in a great executive, specifically a CEO.
Yeah, so I know Pierre filed for the bankruptcy last year. So I just wonder like what happened to Pierre and what you learned from this experience. Like, was it because the product wasn't ready, or was it because the market wasn't ready for Pierre's product?
Yeah, look, we're proud of what Pear tried to do. I think as an idea, digital therapeutics was a really great one. And we were really inspired by what they did. They created great products that had really phenomenal clinical data, and were able to get regulatory approval. But I think the payer market wasn't really there yet to reimburse these things. And so because of that, there were some struggles, and ultimately a restructuring had to happen as a result. But I think as an industry, digital therapeutics has now struggled, but we still hope that eventually there might be bright lights there. Recently there was a big Medicare announcement where they're covering some of these programs now, and so that could potentially be interesting. But ultimately, it's all about bets and timing. And there was a big bet on what Pear was doing in digital therapeutics in general, and I think it was a worthwhile bet to make, because I think there was a great opportunity and potential. And I think a lot of that was de-risked, the clinical piece, the regulatory piece, even some of the commercial piece. But not always is everything ready for prime time. And unfortunately, the reimbursement part wasn't. But I think overall, some of them were. And so it will be interesting to watch what happens in that industry.
Yeah, so I just want to ask, how do you stay updated with the most recent trends and advancements in biotech?
Yeah, I think some of it's reading papers or articles so that you can understand things that are coming out. A lot of it, at least the way I do it, I like conversations. So I talk to a lot of people every day, some in academia, some entrepreneurs, some just investors. So I find that having those different conversations are really helpful. Some of it's going to conferences and seeing the new themes and things that people are speaking about. So I think, it's an amalgamation of all those things. I think it's a lot of information to take into your brain. And so you just need to spend a lot of time talking with a lot of different people that are really intelligent, and hopefully even more intelligent than you are.
So I know you're a founding partner of Old Silver VC. So as a VC, how do you identify and
Yeah.
evaluate promising biotech startups?
Yeah, Old Silver was a vehicle through our family, and we invested in over 20 companies. We want to look at a number of things. I think if it's more on the science side, we're looking at how de-risked the clinical data is. We want to look at who is involved in the company, and we want to believe that they have people involved that really have great ability to lead the charge for that company or the development of the clinical assets. You want to believe that their business model that they put together is sound, and that the commercial area that they're focusing on makes sense. So we look for people to be pretty thoughtful about how they look at all these different things, and that helps us make decisions on, at least at the surface level, is this worth doing? Then there's some more nuanced stuff, like looking at the breadth of intellectual property, looking at their financial position. Do we believe that the amount of money that they're raising makes sense for the next 2 years? Who are they going to hire? Why? What's their justification? So, I think ultimately it's really just like, how thoughtful is this person about all this different areas that they're thinking about, in terms of the development of the company.
So what do you look for in a founder before you invest in a startup? Do you look at his or her personality? Like, what do you
Yeah, I mean, some of it, that's definitely some of it. I think some is their experiences. Where have they been before? How do they talk about those experiences, right? I mean, just because someone had a good experience doesn't mean that they've taken the things that we might want to see from that experience, even if it's a failure. I think how people are able to explain and convey information about the experiences they have had is incredibly important and incredibly insightful into who that person is. If you talk to someone and they had a failure, there's a lot of different ways they can answer. How did they learn? Like your question earlier, how did you learn from that failure? What are the lessons there, and how they're able to justify that, or how they're able to be humble about that. Some people might just be like, well, yeah, this was really good, and they were wrong. That might, in my opinion, might not be as good an answer as someone who, is able to list off 3, 4, or 5 reasons why, it didn't work, and how because of that they're able to do something better in the next trial. So I think thoughtfulness is incredibly important.
Mhm. So I know your family's like in the biotech and healthcare. Have you invested in uh other fields that are not really in biotech, like blockchain, fintech, or maybe AI now?
We tried it, in the past we've mostly done life sciences. We've probably done some stuff outside of there, but usually we try to leverage things in high tech. Not to say I wouldn't look at other things. It's just not you want to lean into your competitive edge. And so that's just not been an area that we've had as much time that we spent. So that's sort of where we have been focusing.
Yeah, so I know one company you're involved in via O2 or VC was ATI Life Science AG. So that went public. Can you describe how the IPO process is like from a VC standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the size of how much money you have in the round. But typically, as a VC, if you're on the later side, you're probably more involved. Unless you're a really big check earlier on, then you might still be more involved later. By the time a company exits, a lot of the early stage investors are not as involved anymore because they're usually more involved in the seed round, the A round, maybe the B round, maybe even the C round. Um, and that's not to say that all funds aren't, but most early stage VCs, they're very helpful at a certain place in time to get the company to where it needs to be. But then there's, growth firms that come in. And so the role that the VCs play over time is very different at each stage of the company. And some of that depends on the relationship between the founder and the VC. Sometimes the VC and the founder will have such a tight-knit relationship that even in the later stages, they're still involved. You certainly can see that too. So some of it just really depends on the firm, the size of the firm, and then how long they've had to wait to go public too, right? That matters as well, right? If a company goes public in 5 years, it's more likely the early stage venture fund is quite instrumental in that. If it's 10 years, then potentially less. They still have a position, but they may be a bit more passive than active if it's more earlier on.
So do you usually sell like a significant portion of your investment when the company IPOs, or do you keep most of your stake in the company?
You're not usually able to sell much for the first 6 months. There's usually a lockup period, and sometimes it can be dictated and pre-baked that it might be longer. I think my personal view, depending on where things are, is sort of case by case. I think there are times when I might think it makes sense to take some off and the other times where it makes sense to leave it in. I think it really depends on the market, what you believe on the company. Those are all factors I think you have to weigh in.
So what are some common challenges biotech startups face, and how can they overcome these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges we see with biotech companies, at least at the early stage, is, what are they focused on? I think a lot of early founders want to do a lot of things, and focus is important. I think having a broad story that they can have to do many things is important too. but I think focus is quite important. So I think that's something that people have to think about when they're evaluating a founder. And I think the other is their ability to be adaptable. At an early stage, things are changing all the time. So as a founder, you have to constantly be thinking about, what happens in this situation? How do I make changes or not? And being able to do that well is a really important skill.
So we're gonna move on to your new VC firm called TRX Capital. So I'm just wondering why you founded like a new firm, because I know you're working at your old firm in Old Silver VC.
Oh, Old Silver's been on pause for about 2 years now.
I see, but like I was wondering why you formed your new VC firm. Like, is there a reason
Yeah,
why?
so Old Silver was a concept fund that our family did, and I think it was a really successful vehicle to be able to explore doing venture investing as our family. But for me, TRX is something where we can be doing things on a broader, larger scale. Again, I can't answer all that much
Yeah.
about TRX because we're still in the fundraising market. So I'm not able to answer many questions about it, just given how SEC laws work in fundraising.
Yeah, so I have a general question. So this is not
Sure.
for TRX Capital. So do you use your own money? Like usually do venture capitals use their own money to form a new firm, or do you pool other people's money to start a firm?
You generally do a combination of both, and every single fund is different on what those ratios are.
I see. Okay. So what trends do you foresee shaping the future of biotech in the next decade?
Yeah, so I think tech will shape it a lot. I think that will allow for biotech to move a lot faster. I think you also need to see more examples of how tech companies and biotech companies work together. I think also talent will then change in terms of how we think about how these companies need to come together. That becomes really important. And then I think the other piece that's really important is we're going to see probably more companies that are sort of younger blood, if you will, meaning I think because of access to capital, you'll have more examples of companies that don't have to just raise 50 million out of the gate and have some 30-year legacy executive from a pharma company leading the way. You might have a PhD and a few other folks that come together to create a company. And so I think that makes biotech investing and entrepreneurship quite interesting as we think about the future.
Yeah, have you had any instance where like the whole board, including you as an investor, like you had to take over control of the company because the founder wasn't like competent enough to continue the company? Has there been an instance like this?
We haven't specifically had to do that, but certainly it has to happen sometimes. And I think you try to do what you can as a fund to help helm the ship so that they bring in good management and that they're able, in addition to bringing in good management, to have a good handoff plan, because both of those pieces are pretty critical.
Yeah, so I know you're an active philanthropist. You co-founded a Young Coder Society, and you teach kids how to code using a Raspberry Pi. So, what made you give back to the community specifically? Like, is it more of
Yeah,
a
when I
personal thing?
about a decade ago, a friend of mine came to me with that opportunity, and I felt like it was a really interesting way of getting kids excited about STEM, which has always been a passion of mine. And I think Raspberry Pis are really fun. They're easy to use, and it's a good way to get kids excited about coding. And I always have liked video games too, and it's a cool sort of format. You can basically do things where you're able to do things with Minecraft as a way of using that as the vehicle to code. And it was I think a great experience for me.
Yeah, so I have a question about VC funding. So I think I read from an article that like I think particularly in the therapeutic side, most founders are around their late 40s or 50s. There's not many like 20s or 30s, adults founding these therapeutic companies. So my question is, why is it that like usually for their therapeutics, like that we have the founders are more older? Because I mean, if you look at like tech industry now, like you have like 19-year-olds, like
Yeah, I mean,
that
I think first of all, I think it's a changing landscape. So I think some of that is changing to some capacity, not completely. I think some of that is because to really fundamentally understand science, you have to have, sometimes a decade of training, whereas in coding, you don't necessarily have to have that. Science, at least currently, I think is probably more technically complicated than coding, which means that the barrier to entry is more significant. I think also, and this is where it gets a difference between tech and science, is it's one thing to understand fundamentally science. It's one thing to fundamentally understand coding, but it's another to understand drug development. And that's very different than having to do anything with coding. Now, I would imagine that AI might have similarities because you have to navigate and think about a lot of different factors, which means you have to have some sort of wisdom to understand those nuances. But I think that that's really the biggest reason why in biotech you often see people being older. But again, to my point earlier, I do think that is changing in some capacities because it is, I think, becoming cheaper to found companies. And I think there are more abilities, and we're starting to see younger founders in biotech.
So, what advice would you give to aspiring entrepreneurs in the
Talk to
biotech
a lot of
field?
people. I think talking to as many people as are willing to talk to you and learning from them and hearing from them, I think there's no better use of your time. I think that way you learn things, you build a network, and I don't think that there's any better way of spending your time when you're younger than that, other than maybe experiences too. Internships are really important. Spending times in labs, especially with scientists who have spun out companies and learning from them, experiences and learning through other people through talking to them. I don't think there's anything better that you can do.
So, what is there any other advice you would give to students specifically who want to pursue biotech or business in general?
Watch your podcast.
Wait, Ashley? Wait.
Yeah. I mean, podcasts are great. Media content is great. I mean, I think those are things that it's helpful because you're getting to hear from people in a really human way how they think about things. So yeah, I think your podcast is a great example of that. I think that's a place that people can learn a lot of really important lessons.
So do you have anything else to add that we never mentioned right now or during this interview?
No, this has been great. I appreciate you having me on, and no, this has been awesome.
Yeah, so I want to say thank you, Mr. Langer, for being part of this episode and giving me the opportunity to talk to you so people can get to know more about your insights into venture capitalists and also
Sure.
investing.